You know that feeling when you're being watched? Like a set of unseen eyes are fixed on you, following every move? That's what I felt that night, driving down Route 47, also known around here as Devil's Stretch. It was just me, my old Ford pickup, and miles of deserted road cutting through dense woods. I had done this drive dozens of times, but that night something felt wrong. I had left my friend Eric's place late, much later than planned. The sky was moonless, and the stars were veiled by thick clouds. The headlights barely cut through the dark. The radio was static, so I left it off. The only sound was the hum of my engine and the occasional crunch of gravel as the tires hit the shoulder. At first, it was the usual unease of being alone in the middle of nowhere. But then, about 20 minutes into the drive, I saw something strange. A figure standing by the side of the road. It was a woman, pale and barefoot, wearing a tattered white dress that clung to her like it had been soaked. Her hair hung like wet strings over her face, and she wasn't moving, just standing there. I slowed down instinctively, and as my headlights swept over her, I swear she looked right at me. Her eyes, they were hollow. Not just dark, empty. My chest tightened. I kept driving, telling myself she was just some drifter or maybe a prank. People love to scare drivers out here, after all. But as I glanced in my rearview mirror, she was gone. Just gone. No sign of her anywhere. I told myself I was seeing things. It had been a long day. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me, but the unease lingered like a weight pressing on my chest. About 10 minutes later, I caught movement in the trees, shadows darting between the trunks, too fast to be deer or coyotes. I tightened my grip on the wheel, trying to focus on the road. That's when the air in the cab turned cold, unnaturally cold, like I just opened a freezer. My breath fogged up in front of me. Then came the thumping. It started faint, like something tapping on the bed of the truck. I glanced in the rearview mirror, but the darkness beyond the taillights was impenetrable. The thumping grew louder, more deliberate, as if someone or something was climbing into the bed. My skin crawled. "Get a grip, man," I muttered, though my voice wavered. Still, I didn't stop. There was no way I was pulling over, not out here, not with whatever this was. The tapping moved, shifting to the roof of the cab. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. I couldn't hear anything over it, not even my own breath. The thumping turned into scratching, nails scraping against the metal roof. I swore under my breath and hit the gas, the engine roaring as the truck sped up, and then a voice, a woman's voice, whispering my name. Mark. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be real. But it was. It was coming from right behind me, soft but unmistakable. Mark. She drew it out like she was savoring the sound. I glanced at the rearview mirror again, my pulse spiking. There she was, sitting in the back seat. Her pale face was inches from mine, her hollow eyes staring straight into me. Her lips curled into a grin that didn't belong on anything human, revealing teeth too sharp, too long. I screamed and jerked the wheel, nearly running off the road. When I looked back, she was gone. The truck skidded to a stop on the gravel shoulder. My chest heaved, and I could barely catch my breath. I didn't want to look around, but I had to. I grabbed my phone and switched on the flashlight, shining it into the back seat. Empty. But then the tapping started again. This time it was at the driver's side window, slow, rhythmic. I turned my head so slowly it felt like I was moving underwater. And there she was. Her face was pressed against the glass, her hollow eyes boring into mine. She opened her mouth impossibly wide and let out a scream that didn't sound human. It was guttural, primal, like something out of a nightmare. I don't even remember putting the truck in gear. All I know is I floored it, tires kicking up gravel as I tore down the road. I didn't stop, not until I reached the gas station at the edge of town. I stumbled out of the truck, shaking so badly I could barely stand. The attendant, an older guy named Joe, took one look at me and knew something was wrong. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, half joking. I didn't laugh. I told him what happened, every word tumbling out in a rush. His face went pale. He put a hand on my shoulder and said, "Son, you're not the first." Joe told me about the legend of Devil's Stretch, about a woman who died there years ago, hit by a car while walking home after her wedding. She was left for dead, and they say her spirit haunts the road looking for someone to take her home or someone to join her. I've never driven that road again. I won't even go near it after dark. Sometimes, though, I still hear the tapping on my windows, on my doors in the dead of night, and when I close my eyes, I see her face, those hollow, empty eyes staring back at me.
Story number 2.
It was supposed to be a quick trip, An hour drive to pick up a secondhand dresser I found on Facebook Marketplace. The seller, an older woman named Margaret, lived in a rural part of Indiana, her farmhouse surrounded by fields and forests. I didn't think twice about it when she said she only accepted cash. It was 9:30 p.m. when I finally started heading back home. The first 20 minutes of the drive were uneventful, the kind of serene quiet you'd expect from the countryside at night. But as I turned onto County Road 88, my GPS flickered. The map froze for a moment, then went blank, leaving me with nothing but a glowing blue dot on a black screen. I cursed under my breath and kept driving. The road was straight, bordered by dense woods on both sides. My phone still had signal, so I figured I'd reconnect soon. But after 10 minutes, the GPS remained dead, and the road ahead didn't look familiar. No signs, no lights, no landmarks, just an endless stretch of asphalt swallowed by darkness. That's when I noticed the car. It appeared out of nowhere, its headlights blinding in my rearview mirror. I hadn't seen it approach, and I hadn't passed any turnoffs where it could have come from. The vehicle kept its distance, its lights glaring but not overtaking me. I figured it was another late-night traveler, though something about it unsettled me. I sped up slightly, hoping to put some distance between us. The car matched my speed. Okay, I thought, no big deal. Coincidence. But when I slowed down, so did they. My chest tightened. I glanced at my phone. It was dead. Not just the GPS, the whole screen. No battery warning, no reboot screen, just black. The road seemed longer than it should have been, like it was stretching into infinity. I checked the time on my dashboard. 10:12 p.m. It felt like I'd been driving for hours, yet I was no closer to home. The car behind me turned off its headlights. My heart stopped. Now I couldn't see it, but I knew it was there. Its presence a dark weight pressing against my back. I told myself to stay calm, to keep driving. I'd find a gas station or a house soon, somewhere I could stop and call for help. But the road remained empty. No signs of life. No side roads. Just me and the invisible car behind me. A thud jolted me in my seat, loud and sudden, like something had slammed into the back of my car. My hands tightened on the wheel. I glanced at the mirror. Nothing. The car behind me was still invisible, its headlights off, but I knew it had hit me. Then came the voices. Faint at first, like whispers carried on the wind. I couldn't make out the words, but they were low and urgent, coming from inside the car. I turned the radio off, thinking it might be interference. The whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, overlapping, like a dozen people were whispering at once, all too close to my ears. My breath quickened. I shouted into the darkness, "What do you want?" The voices stopped. Silence enveloped the car, heavy and suffocating. My headlights flickered, then went out. I hit the brakes, my heart pounding. The world outside was pitch black, and for the first time, I felt truly trapped. My headlights came back on, and my stomach dropped. The road was gone. I was surrounded by trees, their twisted branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal arms. The asphalt had been replaced with dirt, and the familiar hum of my tires was now the crunch of gravel. I slammed on the brakes and skidded to a stop. That's when I saw them. Figures in the woods, dozens of them, standing just beyond the reach of my headlights. They were motionless, their silhouettes barely distinguishable from the trees. My throat tightened as I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. They didn't move, but I felt their gaze, sharp and unrelenting. The car behind me turned its headlights back on, flooding the woods with light. The figures vanished. I didn't wait. I floored the gas pedal, the tires kicking up dirt as I sped away. My heart raced as I weaved through the unfamiliar terrain, my hands trembling on the wheel. The voices returned, louder this time, angry and guttural. They sounded like they were inside the car, screaming in my ears. I screamed back, "Leave me alone." My lights flickered again, and the figures reappeared. This time, they were closer. I could see their faces, or lack thereof. Hollow, gaping voids where eyes and mouths should have been. Their heads twitched unnaturally, and their hands stretched out toward the car. The vehicle behind me honked its horn, a deafening blast that shook the air. The figures recoiled, retreating into the shadows, and for a brief moment, the road reappeared. I swerved onto it without thinking, the tires screeching as they hit the asphalt. I didn't look back. The road ahead was clear now, though I couldn't explain how. My phone buzzed to life, its screen lighting up with notifications. The GPS reconnected, and I saw I was only 2 miles from home. Relief flooded through me, but I didn't slow down until I pulled into my driveway. The car that had been following me was gone. I stumbled out of the car, my legs shaking, and rushed into the house. Locking the door behind me, I collapsed onto the couch, my breath ragged. My phone chimed, and I checked the screen. There was a message from an unknown number. It read, "You're safe for now." I stared at the screen, my blood running cold. How did they know my number? Who were they? Before I could process it, the phone buzzed again. Another message. "We'll see you soon." I dropped the phone and ran to the window. The street outside was empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, I didn't sleep. And even now, weeks later, I can't drive at night, because sometimes when I look in the rearview mirror, I see those hollow faces staring back at me.
Story number 3.
It happened last fall, when the leaves were dying and the wind carried whispers of winter. I was driving home after visiting my parents in a small town a few hours away. The route was familiar, long stretches of quiet highway cutting through fields and patches of forest. I'd driven it 100 times before, but that night, something was different. The first sign was the fog. It rolled in thick and sudden, swallowing the road ahead. My high beams were useless, only bouncing the light back at me. I slowed down to a crawl, gripping the wheel tighter. It wasn't just the fog, it was the silence. Usually, even in the dead of night, you'd hear crickets or the hum of distant traffic. But this night, there was nothing. Just the low rumble of my engine and my own uneasy breathing. I told myself it was fine. I'd be out of the fog soon. But as I kept driving, the road felt wrong. It should have been a straight shot, but now it seemed to curve in ways I didn't remember. Landmarks I should have passed by now, an old gas station, a lone oak tree, never appeared. I checked the clock on the dashboard, 11:47 p.m., but it had been 11:47 for what felt like hours. That's when I saw her. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. A figure standing on the shoulder of the road, barely visible in the swirling mist. She was wearing a dark dress that clung to her frame, her hair hanging limp around her face. She didn't move, didn't signal for help, just stood there, staring straight ahead. Instinctively, I slowed down. The closer I got, the more wrong she looked. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her arms hung unnaturally long at her sides. As my headlights illuminated her, she turned her head toward me. Her face was wrong. Her eyes were black pits, hollow and endless, and her mouth stretched into a jagged, unnatural grin. My stomach dropped. I hit the gas, swerving around her. As I sped away, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror. She was standing in the middle of the road now, her head tilted as if watching me leave. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was when she waved. It wasn't a normal wave. It was slow, deliberate, as if she was saying, "See you soon." I drove faster, the fog thickening around me. My chest was tight, my pulse pounding in my ears. I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was a prank, a creepy mannequin, some kids messing with late-night drivers. But deep down, I knew better. The road stretched on endlessly, and I began to feel like I wasn't alone. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I could feel something. A presence, heavy and suffocating. It was in the car with me. Then I heard it. A faint scratching sound, like nails dragging across metal. It was coming from the roof of the car. My heart felt like it might explode. I didn't dare look up. I just kept driving, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. The scratching grew louder, more insistent. Then it stopped, replaced by a new sound, a soft, wet thud, like something heavy sliding off the roof. I glanced in the mirror, and my blood ran cold. She was on the road behind me, crouched on all fours like a spider. Her head twisted at an impossible angle, her black eyes locked on mine. Her mouth moved, whispering something I couldn't hear, but I could feel it, like icy fingers clawing at my mind. I screamed and slammed the gas pedal to the floor. The car roared forward, the fog thinning as I sped down the unfamiliar road. My eyes darted between the windshield and the mirror, but she was gone. For now. I started to think I was safe, that I'd escaped. Then the radio turned on by itself, blasting static so loud it made me jump. I reached to turn it off, but a voice cut through the static, soft, sing-song, and sickeningly sweet. "Don't run, Mark. You can't hide." My name. She knew my name. I yanked the volume knob, but the radio wouldn't shut off. The voice continued, her tone shifting between mocking laughter and guttural growls. "You can't escape. You're already mine." The dashboard lights flickered, and the engine sputtered. I was still speeding down the road, but now the car felt like it was struggling, as if something was holding it back. Then the headlights dimmed, and I was plunged into darkness. The car came to a dead stop. I sat there, frozen, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The fog was gone, and the night was eerily still. I tried turning the key, but the engine wouldn't start. I was stranded, alone in the middle of nowhere. Then came the knock. A single, deliberate knock on the driver's side window. I turned my head slowly, terrified of what I might see. There she was, inches from my face, her hollow eyes boring into mine, her mouth twisted into that jagged grin, revealing rows of blackened, sharp teeth. "Let me in," she whispered. I screamed, fumbling with the lock as if locking the door would somehow keep her out. Her grin widened, and she began to laugh, a sound that was both human and inhuman, like nails on a chalkboard mixed with the wail of a dying animal. I closed my eyes, trembling, and started praying, whispering words I hadn't said since I was a kid. When I opened them, she was gone. The fog had lifted and the road ahead was clear. The car started as if nothing had happened, and I floored it, driving like a madman until I reached the lights of the nearest town. I pulled into a gas station, shaking so badly I could barely stand. The attendant gave me a strange look but didn't say anything as I stumbled inside. I didn't tell anyone what happened. Who would believe me? But I know what I saw, and I know I'll never take that road again. Sometimes, though, I still hear the knock. Late at night, when I'm alone in my room, I'll hear it. A single, deliberate knock on the window. I don't look. I don't dare look, because I know she's there, waiting for me to let her in.
Story number 4.
I should have taken the long way home. That's what my gut told me when I turned onto Old Mill Road, a shortcut I'd used plenty of times before. It was a narrow, winding strip of asphalt that cut through miles of forest with no streetlights and barely any cell reception. Locals called it Widow's Way, but no one ever explained why. I always assumed it was one of those small-town urban legends meant to scare kids. It was a little after 11 p.m., and I was heading home after a long shift at the diner. The woods loomed on both sides, the tall trees forming a tunnel that swallowed my car in shadows. My headlights barely pierced the dark, and the hum of my engine felt too loud in the oppressive silence. I turned up the radio to break the stillness, but it only made things worse. Static. Nothing but static, no matter how many stations I tried. Frustrated, I switched it off, leaving just the sound of my tires on the cracked pavement. I had just passed the halfway point when I saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, my heart leaping into my throat. The car screeched to a stop, the headlights illuminating what I thought was a man. He was tall, wearing a dark coat that hung loosely off his frame, his head down so I couldn't see his face. His hands dangled unnaturally at his sides, too long, with fingers that seemed to twitch. "Hey, you okay?" I called out, rolling the window down just a crack. My voice sounded small, swallowed by the trees. He didn't respond, didn't move, just stood there, head tilted slightly like he was listening. A chill crept down my spine. Something was wrong. I couldn't explain it, but I knew. The air felt heavier, colder, and every instinct screamed at me to leave. I shifted into reverse, ready to back up when he finally moved. His head snapped up, and I froze. He didn't have a face. Just smooth, featureless skin where his eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. I gasped, slamming the gear into drive and flooring it. The car lurched forward, swerving around him as my tires skidded on the uneven road. I didn't look back, didn't dare check the mirrors. I just drove as fast as the car would go, the forest blurring around me. But the farther I went, the worse it got. The road, which should have ended at the highway by now, seemed to stretch on endlessly. The trees closed in tighter, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. The air inside the car grew stifling, and my chest felt heavy, like something was pressing down on me. Then I saw him again. He was standing by the side of the road this time, that same featureless face turned toward me. I didn't slow down. I didn't even blink. But as I sped past, I saw him again. Another figure, identical to the first, standing further down the road, and another, and another. They lined the road, motionless, their heads turning as I passed. Panic clawed at my throat. My hands shook on the wheel, and I could barely keep the car straight. I tried to call someone, anyone, but my phone was dead. Not just no service, completely off. The battery had been full when I left the diner. The figures began to move. At first, it was subtle, a twitch of the head, a shift of the shoulders. But soon they were stepping onto the road, walking toward me. I honked the horn, but it didn't matter. They didn't flinch, didn't stop. They just kept coming, their featureless faces turned toward the car. I swerved around them, barely missing one as it reached out, its long fingers grazing the passenger side window. My chest tightened and I couldn't breathe. They were everywhere now, spilling out of the woods, their movements jerky and unnatural. One appeared directly in front of the car, and I had no choice. I hit it head on, the impact jolting me forward. But there was no sound, no thud, no crunch of metal. When I looked in the rearview mirror, there was nothing. No body, just the empty road. And still, they came. My headlights flickered, casting the forest in eerie shadows. The engine sputtered, the car lurching as if it might die at any moment. I whispered a desperate prayer, begging for this nightmare to end. The road twisted sharply, and as I turned the corner, I saw it. A house. It sat at the edge of a clearing, its windows glowing faintly with warm light. It was the first sign of life I'd seen, and I didn't care how strange it was. I pulled into the gravel driveway, my tires kicking up dust as I skidded to a stop. I stumbled out of the car, my legs barely holding me up. The figures were gone, the forest eerily quiet, but I knew they weren't far. The house loomed before me, its wooden door slightly ajar as if inviting me in. I hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside. The interior was dim, lit by a single flickering lamp on a small table. The air smelled of dust and decay, and the floorboards creaked under my weight. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I stepped further in, my eyes adjusting to the gloom. The walls were lined with photographs, black and white images of people with faces scratched out. My stomach churned as I recognized one of the faceless figures from the road. A door slammed shut somewhere behind me, and I spun around. The entryway was gone. Instead, there was only a blank wall. Panic surged through me as I turned back toward the room, but it had changed. The furniture was gone, replaced by rows of mirrors. Each one reflected a different version of me. Some distorted, some impossibly old, and one without a face. My reflection stepped forward, pressing its hands against the glass. Its mouth stretched into a grotesque smile that shouldn't have been possible. "Welcome home," it whispered. I ran, crashing through the mirrors as the reflections screamed, their jagged shards slicing my arms and legs. The hallway twisted and turned, and I couldn't tell if I was going deeper into the house or backtracking. The walls seemed to breathe, pulsing like they were alive. Finally, I burst through a door and found myself back in my car. The engine was running, the headlights illuminating the road. My hands were on the wheel, but I didn't remember getting there. I didn't question it. I floored the gas and sped away, the house disappearing in the rearview mirror. The road was clear now, the woods no longer suffocating, but the dread lingered. I made it home that night, but something followed me. I see them sometimes, the figures, standing at the edge of my yard or reflected in the windows. And at night, when everything is still, I hear the whisper, "Welcome home."
Story number 5.
I've always loved night drives. There's something peaceful about the open road, the hum of the engine, and the world reduced to nothing but what your headlights reveal. That night, I wasn't seeking peace, though. I was running. From a fight with my boyfriend, from the suffocating walls of our tiny apartment, from the weight of a relationship that felt like it was falling apart. I headed out on Highway 6, a quiet stretch of road winding through miles of farmland and forest. The clock on the dashboard read 11:13 p.m. I didn't have a destination, just a need to escape, to feel the cold air rushing through the cracked window and let the silence wash over me. About 30 minutes into the drive, I saw it. A hitchhiker standing at the side of the road. He was tall and thin, his clothes dark and worn, his head bowed so his face was hidden beneath the brim of a battered hat. He held out his thumb, the universal plea for a ride. I wouldn't normally stop for a hitchhiker, especially not at night, but something about him caught my attention. Maybe it was the way he stood, unnervingly still, like he'd been waiting just for me. Against my better judgment, I pulled over. The man climbed into the passenger seat without a word. As he closed the door, I caught a whiff of something metallic, sharp, and cold. It wasn't entirely unpleasant, but it set me on edge. "Where are you headed?" I asked, forcing cheerfulness into my voice. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned his head slightly, just enough that I could see his face, or lack thereof. His features were blurred, like a photograph out of focus. My stomach twisted, but I told myself it was just the dim light playing tricks on me. "I'll take you as far as the next town," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He nodded, a slow, deliberate movement that made my skin crawl. As we drove, the silence grew oppressive. I tried to make conversation, asking him where he was from, where he was going, but he didn't respond. He just sat there, staring straight ahead. His hands rested in his lap, unnaturally still, the fingers long and thin, almost skeletal. The road stretched on, darker than I remembered. The trees seemed to close in on either side, their gnarled branches clawing at the night sky. The man shifted in his seat, and I glanced at him. His head was turned toward me now, his face still indistinct, but his eyes were black holes, empty and endless. My pulse quickened, and I gripped the wheel tighter. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He smiled then, a slow, chilling curve of his lips that seemed to stretch too wide. "I'm fine," he said, his voice low and hollow, like the wind howling through a cavern. I wanted to pull over to tell him to get out, but I couldn't. My hands felt glued to the wheel, my foot locked on the gas pedal. The car seemed to have a mind of its own, speeding down the road as the world outside blurred into darkness. The hitchhiker began to hum. It was a low, mournful tune that sent shivers down my spine. I tried to block it out, focusing on the road, but it seemed to grow louder, filling the car, wrapping around me like a cold embrace. Then the headlights flickered. The road ahead disappeared into blackness, and when the lights came back on, it wasn't the same road. The asphalt was cracked and uneven, the edges crumbling into a void of nothingness. The trees were gone, replaced by towering silhouettes that looked like human figures, their limbs twisted and stretched unnaturally. I glanced at the man, my heart pounding. He was looking at me now, his black eyes boring into mine. "We're almost there," he said, his voice sending a wave of cold through me. "Where?" I managed to choke out, my throat dry. "You'll see." The car jerked violently, and I realized the road was tilting, slanting downward like a roller coaster, plunging into darkness. The figures lining the edges began to move, stepping closer, their shapes flickering like a distorted film. Their faces were blank, smooth and featureless, but I could feel their eyes on me, feel their hunger. The hum turned into a chant, low and guttural, the words incomprehensible but filled with menace. The hitchhiker leaned closer, his breath icy against my skin. "Do you want to know where this road ends?" he whispered. "No," I said, my voice trembling. "I just want to go home." He laughed then, a sound that echoed inside my skull, sharp and jagged. "There's no going back." The car plunged into total darkness, and I screamed, the sound swallowed by the void. The air grew heavy, pressing down on my chest, stealing my breath. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the car jolted to a stop. I opened my eyes, gasping for air. The hitchhiker was gone. The car was parked on the shoulder of the road, the familiar glow of my dashboard lighting the interior. The clock read 12:07 a.m. I looked around, my hands shaking. The road was empty, stretching out into the night. There were no figures, no cracks in the pavement, no sign of the man who had been sitting beside me. I drove home in a daze, my mind racing. When I pulled into the driveway, I sat in the car for a long time, staring at my hands, trying to convince myself it had all been a bad dream. But when I got out and looked at the passenger seat, I froze. There, on the fabric, was a single black feather, and in the distance, carried on the wind, I heard the hum.
Story number 6.
I was driving through the Appalachian Mountains late one October night, heading back to college after visiting home for the weekend. The sky was an inky black, stars scattered like flecks of frost, and the road twisted and turned through dense forest, shrouded in mist. I hadn't seen another car for miles, and the isolation was starting to get to me. The drive was supposed to be scenic, but at night, it felt foreboding. Trees loomed over the road like towering sentinels, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky. The only sound was the low hum of my engine and the occasional rustle of leaves caught in the wind. I'd been on the road for over 3 hours when my fuel gauge caught my eye. The needle was hovering precariously close to E. I cursed under my breath, realizing I'd forgotten to fill up before leaving. I'd passed a small town about an hour back, but out here, gas stations were few and far between. As if on cue, I spotted a flickering neon sign ahead, the letters spelling out gas barely visible through the fog. Relieved, I pulled in. The station looked like it had been plucked straight out of a horror movie, an old, dilapidated building with a single pump and broken windows. The fluorescent lights above the pump buzzed faintly, casting a sickly yellow glow. I got out of the car, shivering as the night air bit through my jacket. The pump was ancient, with a rusted handle and faded numbers. I lifted it, but it didn't click on. A sign taped to the side read, "Pay inside," in smudged black marker. Reluctantly, I approached the building. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and a bell jingled somewhere in the shadows. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of mildew and oil. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with dusty cans of motor oil and outdated snacks. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, swinging slightly as if disturbed by an unseen hand. Behind the counter stood a man. He was gaunt, his skin pale and stretched tight over his bones. His eyes were sunken, their dark hollows fixed on me as I entered. His lips pulled into a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Evening," he said, his voice raspy. "Help you?" I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to leave. But I needed gas. Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "Just need to fill up." He nodded slowly, his grin widening. "Pump's ready now, but you should be careful out there." "Careful?" I echoed, already stepping back toward the door. "Strange things happen on these roads at night," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "People disappear. Cars break down and no one ever finds them." I laughed nervously, unsure if he was trying to scare me or just making conversation. "Thanks for the warning," I muttered, heading back to the car. The pump worked this time, and I filled the tank as quickly as I could, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. The forest seemed closer now, the shadows darker and deeper. As I replaced the nozzle and got back in the car, I noticed something odd. The man was standing at the window, watching me. His grin was gone, replaced by an expression I couldn't quite read. Worry? Fear? It sent a chill down my spine. I didn't stick around to find out. I pulled out of the station and back onto the road, my headlights cutting through the fog. The gas station disappeared in the rearview mirror, and I tried to shake off the unease that clung to me like a second skin. That's when I saw the figure. It was standing on the side of the road, barely visible in the mist. At first, I thought it was a person, a hitchhiker maybe, but as I got closer, I realized it wasn't quite right. It was tall, unnaturally so, its limbs too long and thin. Its head was cocked at an odd angle, as if it was watching me. I swerved to avoid it, my heart hammering in my chest. When I glanced in the rearview mirror, it was gone. I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the fog and my tired mind. But a few minutes later, I saw it again. This time, it was standing in the middle of the road. I hit the brakes hard, the car skidding to a stop just a few feet away. The thing didn't move. Its face, or what should have been a face, was a smooth, featureless void. It raised one long arm and pointed at me, its hand unnaturally thin and claw-like. Panic surged through me. I slammed the car into reverse, my tires screeching as I backed up. The thing didn't chase me, didn't move at all. It just stood there, pointing as if marking me for something. I turned the car around and sped back the way I'd come, my heart racing. The road seemed longer now, twisting and turning in ways I didn't remember. The fog thickened, swallowing the trees and reducing my visibility to just a few feet. And then I saw the gas station. It was the same one I just left, down to the flickering sign and the broken windows. My stomach dropped. I hadn't turned around, I was sure of it. But somehow, I was back. The pump lights flickered as I pulled in, and I saw him, the man from the counter. He was standing in the doorway, staring at me. His face was different now, gaunt and hollow, his eyes filled with something dark and endless. "You can't leave," he said, his voice echoing in my mind, even though I hadn't rolled down the window. I hit the gas, swerving out of the lot and back onto the road. The car roared forward, but no matter how far I drove, the road never changed. The forest stayed the same, the mist never lifted, and the gas station always appeared just ahead, waiting for me. The figure was waiting too. Every time I passed, it was closer. First on the side of the road, then in the middle, then standing at the edge of the gas station lot, its blank face turned toward me. I don't know how long I drove. Hours, maybe days. Time didn't feel real anymore. The gas gauge never moved. The clock on the dashboard stayed frozen at 12:06, and the road never ended. And then the radio came on. It was static at first, crackling and hissing, but beneath it, I could hear something. A voice, soft and distorted. "You can't leave," it whispered, over and over. "You belong here." I screamed, slamming the dashboard with my fists, begging for it to stop. The voice grew louder, more insistent, until it filled the car, drowning out my thoughts. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The road opened up ahead, the mist lifting to reveal a stretch of highway bathed in moonlight. I burst into tears, relief washing over me as I realized I was free. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror, my blood ran cold. The figure was in the back seat, its smooth face inches from mine. The last thing I heard was its whisper, "You can't leave."
Story number 7.
I was heading back home after a weekend at my parents' place in northern Maine. It was late. later than I'd planned to leave, and the 2 hour drive through backwoods roads felt like a gauntlet of shadows and silence. The kind of quiet that makes you second guess every creak of the car and every distant rustle in the trees. The road, a narrow 2 lane stretch flanked by dense forest, seemed to go on forever. The headlights barely cut through the thick fog, and the moon was hidden behind heavy clouds. I knew this road well, having driven it dozens of times, but something about it that night felt different. The trees seemed closer, the darkness more oppressive. I'd been driving for about 45 minutes when I noticed the first strange thing. A deer was standing on the side of the road. Not unusual for the area, but this one didn't move. It just stood there, completely still, its eyes reflecting the headlights like tiny mirrors. Normally, deer scatter at the sound of an approaching car, but this one didn't even flinch. Its head turned slowly as I passed. Its eyes locked on me until it disappeared into the rearview mirror. I shook it off, chalking it up to fatigue or the eerie stillness of the night playing tricks on me. But a few miles later, I saw another deer. Or maybe it was the same one. It was standing in the exact same position, staring at me with those unblinking, reflective eyes. My stomach knotted as I drove past, watching it in the mirror until it was swallowed by the darkness. The third time, I knew something was wrong. It wasn't just a deer anymore. It was something else. The body was the same, but its movements were off, too fluid, almost human. Its head followed me as I passed, and I could have sworn its mouth curled into something like a smile. I pressed the accelerator, my heart racing. The car's engine roared as I sped down the empty road, but no matter how far I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. And then I saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the car came to a stop just a few feet away. My heart pounded as I stared at the figure, illuminated by the harsh glare of the headlights. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs too long, its skin pale and stretched taut over its frame. Its face was shadowed, but I could see its eyes, wide and dark, boring into me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The figure tilted its head as if curious, and then it stepped toward the car. That broke the spell. I threw the car into reverse, the tires spinning as I backed up, then slammed it into drive and swerved around the figure. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep the wheel steady, but I didn't dare look back. The road stretched on, endless and unchanging. The trees seemed to close in around me, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The fog thickened, clinging to the car and muffling the world outside. And then the radio turned on. I hadn't touched it, but suddenly the static filled the car, loud and jarring. I reached for the knob to turn it off, but before I could, a voice cut through the noise. "You can't leave," it said, low and distorted. I froze, my hand hovering over the dial. The voice came again, clearer this time. "Turn around." "No," I whispered, gripping the wheel tighter. The voice laughed, a hollow, guttural sound that sent shivers down my spine. "You're already ours." The car shuddered, the engine sputtering as if it were struggling to stay alive. The headlights flickered, casting brief, distorted shadows that danced along the road. I pressed the gas pedal harder, willing the car to keep moving, but the road ahead seemed to stretch further and further, as if I were driving in place. Then I saw them, figures standing on either side of the road. They emerged from the trees, their bodies impossibly tall and thin, their faces smooth and featureless. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel their eyes on me, feel their presence pressing against my mind like a weight I couldn't shake. I kept driving, my pulse pounding in my ears. The figures grew closer, stepping onto the road one by one, forming a line that stretched across the pavement. I swerved to avoid them, the car skidding as I narrowly missed hitting one. But no matter how fast I drove, they were always there, ahead of me, behind me, beside me. Their smooth, blank faces turned toward me, their presence filling the car with a suffocating sense of dread. The voice on the radio returned, louder and more insistent. "You belong here," it said, the words reverberating through my skull. "Stop running." "I'm not yours," I shouted, tears streaming down my face. The laughter came again, a cacophony of voices now, overlapping and echoing, filling the car until I thought my head would split. And then everything went silent. The car's engine cut out, the headlights dimmed, and the world was plunged into darkness. I sat there, trembling, the silence pressing in around me like a heavy blanket. And then I saw it, a single pair of eyes glowing in the darkness ahead. They weren't deer eyes, weren't human eyes. They were something else entirely, something ancient and malevolent. They stared at me, unblinking, as a figure emerged from the shadows. It was the same figure I'd seen before, tall and gaunt, its movements unnaturally smooth. But now I could see its face, or rather, the lack of it. Where its features should have been, there was only a swirling void, a black abyss that seemed to pull at my very soul. It raised one long arm, pointing at me, and then it spoke. Not aloud, but inside my mind. "You can't leave," it said. "This road is ours, and now so are you." I don't remember much after that. When I woke up, the car was parked on the side of the road, the engine idling. The sun was rising, the fog burned away by the first rays of light. I drove the rest of the way home in silence, my hands white-knuckled on the wheel. I don't take that road anymore. I don't drive at night. But sometimes when I'm alone, I hear the static, and in the corner of my eye, I see the figure, watching, waiting, and I know they're still out there.
Story number 8.
It was supposed to be a quick drive, no more than an hour, to drop my friend Lisa off at her parents' place in a rural part of Pennsylvania. The night was crisp and clear, the moon casting a pale glow over the winding backroads. I had no reason to feel uneasy, but something about the night felt off. Lisa and I had been joking and chatting the entire way, but as we got deeper into the countryside, her mood shifted. She grew quiet, her eyes flickering toward the trees that lined the road. I asked if she was okay, and she just shrugged, giving me a weak smile. "Just keep your eyes on the road," she said, her voice low. The road stretched ahead, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through dense woods. My car's headlights illuminated the occasional road sign, but otherwise it felt like we were the only ones for miles. The trees seemed to close in the further we drove, their branches forming a skeletal canopy overhead. It wasn't until we passed a rusted, bullet-riddled sign reading Larkin Hollow, Pop 47 Sar, that Lisa's demeanor changed entirely. "Don't stop," she said sharply, her voice tinged with urgency. I frowned, glancing at her. "What are you talking about?" Her hands gripped the edges of her seat. "If something happens, just keep driving, no matter what." Her words sent a chill down my spine, but I forced a laugh, trying to lighten the mood. "You're being dramatic, Lisa. What's the big deal?" She didn't answer. She just stared straight ahead, her face pale. We drove on in tense silence for a few minutes until I saw movement at the edge of the headlights. It was quick, like a shadow darting across the road. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice tight. Lisa nodded, her knuckles white against the seat. "Don't stop." My pulse quickened as the shadows danced at the periphery of my vision. I told myself it was just animals, raccoons or deer, but the shapes were too tall, too upright. As we rounded a bend, the car's headlights illuminated a figure standing in the middle of the road. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. He was tall and thin, his face obscured by the hood of a long, dark coat. He stood perfectly still, his head slightly tilted, as though he were studying us. I slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt just a few feet away from him. "What the hell?" I muttered, my hands trembling on the wheel. Lisa grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Go around him, now." The man didn't move, didn't react at all to the car or the blaring headlights. His stillness was unnerving, almost unnatural. I hesitated, my instincts warring with logic. What if he needs help? Lisa's voice was sharp, almost panicked. "That's not a man. Go." Her words sent a bolt of fear through me, and I did as she said, steering the car around him. As we passed, I couldn't help but glance at him. His face was wrong. It wasn't a face at all, just a smooth, featureless expanse of skin. My breath caught in my throat, and I pressed the gas pedal harder, the car surging forward. Lisa was muttering something under her breath, a prayer or a mantra, I couldn't tell. The road ahead seemed endless, the darkness pressing in from all sides. I kept my eyes fixed on the yellow lines, trying to ignore the chill creeping up my spine. Then the car's engine sputtered. "No, no, no," I whispered, my heart pounding as the dashboard lights flickered. Lisa's voice was tight with fear. "Don't stop. Whatever you do, don't stop." But the car had other plans. It lurched once, then died, rolling to a stop in the middle of the road. The silence was deafening. "Start it again," Lisa urged, her voice trembling. I turned the key, but the engine wouldn't catch. The headlights dimmed, leaving us in near-total darkness. And then we heard it. A low, guttural sound, like a growl coming from the woods. Lisa's breathing quickened. "They're here." I didn't want to ask what she meant. I didn't want to know. The growling grew louder, joined by the sound of branches snapping and leaves rustling. Shapes began to emerge from the tree line, tall and gaunt, their limbs unnaturally long. Their movements were jerky, like marionettes controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer. One of them stepped closer, its face illuminated by the faint glow of the dying headlights. Like the man in the road, it had no features, just smooth, pale skin stretched tight over its skull. "Lock the doors," Lisa hissed. My hands fumbled with the lock, my fingers slick with sweat. The figures surrounded the car, their blank faces pressed against the windows. Their hands, bony, claw-like, scraped against the glass, making a sound that set my teeth on edge. Lisa was crying now, her voice barely a whisper. "They want us to open the door. Don't let them in." I nodded, my breath coming in shallow gasps. One of the creatures tilted its head as if studying me. Its hand reached for the driver's side window, pressing against it with enough force to make the glass creak. And then it spoke. Its voice was a chorus, deep and resonant, echoing in my head rather than my ears. "Come with us." "No," I choked out, tears streaming down my face. Lisa screamed as another figure began clawing at her window, its hands leaving deep gouges in the glass. I don't know what came over me, but I turned the key again, desperation fueling my movements. The engine roared to life, the headlights flaring brightly. The creatures recoiled, their movements frantic and disjointed, as if the light was burning them. "Go!" Lisa shouted. I slammed my foot on the gas, the car lurching forward. The figures scattered, their hollow faces disappearing into the shadows as we sped down the road. We didn't stop, didn't speak, until we reached Lisa's parents' driveway. She got out without a word, her face pale and her hands shaking. Before she shut the door, she leaned in and said, "Never drive through Larkin Hollow again." I nodded, unable to respond. To this day, I don't know what those things were or why they let us go, but I've never taken that route again. And sometimes, late at night, I dream of blank faces and clawed hands waiting for me in the dark.
Story number 9.
The gas gauge was nearly on empty, and I cursed myself for not filling up before leaving the city. The road stretched endlessly before me, a lonely ribbon of asphalt cutting through vast, desolate farmland. The only illumination came from the dim headlights of my car and the pale, crescent moon hanging low in the sky. I was on my way to visit an old college friend who lived in a small town in Kansas. The directions on my GPS had taken me off the interstate and onto an unfamiliar back road, one that seemed to grow darker and narrower with each passing mile. When I spotted a weathered gas station up ahead, I felt a wave of relief. The building looked ancient, its paint peeling and its windows clouded with grime, but it was open. A single dim light flickered above the pumps, casting long, wavering shadows across the cracked concrete. I pulled up to the pump and stepped out of the car, shivering as a cold breeze cut through the night. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as though it were weighing down on me. I glanced around, expecting to see someone, an attendant, another customer, but the place was deserted. The pump didn't take cards, so I walked toward the small booth, where a faint light glowed inside. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, and the smell of stale air and mildew hit me like a wall. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the empty space. A man emerged from behind the counter. He was tall and thin, with sunken cheeks and deep-set eyes that seemed to gleam in the dim light. His clothes were old-fashioned, like something out of the 1950s, a button-up shirt with suspenders and scuffed leather shoes. "Need gas?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. "Yeah, pump number 3, I replied, handing him a 20. He didn't take the bill right away. Instead, he stared at me, his gaze intense and unblinking. "You're not from around here, are you?" "No," I said, shifting uncomfortably. "Just passing through." He nodded slowly, finally taking the money. As he rang it up on an old cash register, he said, "Be careful on the road ahead. Strange things happen out there at night." I forced a laugh, thinking he was just trying to spook me. "Thanks for the warning." He didn't smile. "I mean it. Stay on the main road and don't stop for anyone." His words lingered in my mind as I returned to the car and started pumping gas. The wind had picked up, rustling the tall grass that surrounded the station. It sounded almost like whispers, soft and indistinct. As I finished filling up, I noticed something strange. Across the road, barely visible in the moonlight, was a figure standing in the field. It was far away, but I could tell it wasn't moving, just standing there, facing the gas station. I felt a chill run down my spine. I got back in the car, locking the doors instinctively. When I looked back toward the field, the figure was gone. Shaking it off as paranoia, I pulled out of the station and continued down the road. The man's warning echoed in my mind, but I told myself it was just small-town superstition. The road grew darker as I drove, the moon slipping behind a thick bank of clouds. The trees that lined the edges of the field seemed to close in, their gnarled branches forming twisted silhouettes against the night sky. And then I saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the road, illuminated by my headlights. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding as the car screeched to a stop. It was a woman, her long, dark hair hanging in matted strands around her face. She was barefoot, wearing a tattered white dress that looked like it hadn't been washed in years. I rolled down the window slightly, just enough to call out, "Are you okay? Do you need help?" She didn't respond. She just stood there, her head tilted slightly to one side. Something about her felt off. Her stillness, her silence, it was unnatural. I honked the horn, hoping to snap her out of whatever trance she was in. That's when she moved, not toward the car, but away from it, backing slowly into the shadows at the side of the road. Her movements were jerky, almost mechanical, like a puppet on invisible strings. The moment she disappeared into the darkness, I hit the gas and sped past the spot where she'd been standing. My hands were trembling on the wheel, my mind racing with questions. Who was she? Why was she out here alone? A few minutes later, I saw her again. She was standing on the side of the road this time, her head bowed, her arms hanging limply at her sides. It didn't make sense. I had been driving at least 60 miles an hour. There was no way she could have gotten ahead of me. Panic set in, and I pressed harder on the accelerator, my eyes darting between the road and the rearview mirror. And then I heard it. A faint tapping sound coming from the back window. I didn't want to look. Every instinct told me not to, but I couldn't stop myself. In the mirror, I saw her. She was clinging to the back of the car, her pale face pressed against the glass, her eyes wide and empty. I screamed, swerving wildly as I tried to shake her off. The car fishtailed, tires squealing, but she didn't budge. Her mouth opened, and though I couldn't hear her, I could see her lips forming words. "Let me in." The words repeated over and over, her face contorting into a grotesque grin. I slammed the brakes, the car skidding to a stop. When I turned around, she was gone. My heart was racing as I floored the gas pedal, desperate to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever that was. The road felt endless, the darkness suffocating. And then, up ahead, I saw lights. A small diner glowing like a beacon in the night. I pulled into the parking lot, my hands still shaking as I stumbled out of the car and into the diner. The place was nearly empty, just a couple of truckers at the counter and a tired-looking waitress pouring coffee. I slid into a booth, my body trembling as I tried to catch my breath. The waitress came over, her kind eyes scanning my face. "You okay, hon? You look like you've seen a ghost." I forced a laugh, but it came out hollow. "Just a rough drive," she nodded knowingly. "These roads can be strange at night." As she walked away, I glanced out the window toward my car, and there she was, standing under the flickering neon sign, staring straight at me.